Rahim had learned this early, at the age of 9, standing barefoot in the snow, while his father's body swung from the old mulberry tree at the edge of the village square. He had learned it from the way the wind kept moving, indifferent and cold, cutting through his thin cotton camise, as though he were made of nothing. He had learned it from the way the crows returned to the branches above his father's head not 10 minutes after the men had dispersed, settling their black weight onto the wood, as though the world had offered them nothing more remarkable than a new perch. The mountains rose around the village of Sarpool like the walls of God's courthouse, white and absolute, their peaks lost in clouds that moved too slowly to be called moving at all. They had witnessed everything and would testify to nothing. Rahim understood this now, 16 years later, as he stood in the pre-dawn darkness outside the stable with a bucket of cold water and a handful of barley, his breath rising in small ghosts that dissolved before they reached the stars. He was 25 years old, and he had learned to make himself invisible. This was not a metaphor. It was a survival skill, practiced with the same deliberate patience a man might use to learn to read or to pray. He had learned to keep his eyes cast slightly downward, not in genuine submission, but at the exact angle that would be read as submission by men who needed to see it. He had learned to speak in the register of someone who had no interior life worth examining. He had learned to move through rooms the way shadows move through rooms, present but not insisting on it, occupying space without claiming it. His name, in this village, in this life, was Rahim. Just Rahim. No father's name attached, which was unusual, which was the kind of thing that invited questions, and so he had constructed around this absence a small myth of illegitimacy, of a mother who had fled some neighboring district, of origins so humble they were not worth discussing. The men here were not, in the main, curious about stable boys. This had saved him. The stable itself was a long stone structure built against the eastern face of the hill, so that the mountain itself formed its back wall. It held 11 horses of various temperaments, the heavy-footed maras used for transport, the 2 geldings that carried the tribal leaders' sons on their patrols, the old gray stallion whose best years were behind him, and who stood most of the day with his lower lip hanging in a kind of philosophical resignation. And then, at the far end, in the last stall that had been reinforced with additional timber and iron bolts, there was the black one. His name, to the extent anyone used it, was Shaitan, devil. Rahim called him nothing, at least not yet. Naming was a form of relationship, and he was not yet sure they had won. Zarif Khan's compound sat at the highest point of the village, which was itself at the highest point of this valley, which sat cupped between mountains that rose another 3,000 meters above it. The compound's walls were thick mud brick that had been whitewashed once, long ago, and were now the color of old bone. The main gate was iron-studded wood, and above it, in the years when Zarif Khan had wanted people to remember certain things, there had been heads on poles. There were none there now, but everyone who passed through the gate did so with the memory of having seen them. Zarif Khan was 61 years old and built like something that had been compressed by enormous pressure over a long time. He was not tall, but he was dense, his body carrying a quality of immovable weight. His beard was white and full. His eyes were the pale, almost colorless gray that some mountain people carried. And when he looked at you, the experience was one of being assessed for a purpose that had nothing to do with your own interests. He had consolidated control of this valley 18 years ago, after the previous arrangement, a council of 3 elders, had produced the kind of instability that men like Zarif Khan described as chaos and resolved with violence. He collected horses the way other men collected grievances, obsessively, with an eye for beauty, and with no real understanding of how to sustain what he'd acquired. The black stallion had come to him 2 years ago from a trader out of Kunduz who had, the story went, acquired him from a Uzbek horseman, who had acquired him from a Kyrgyz breeder, whose name no one could now remember. What was remembered was that the horse had been, at some earlier point in his life, magnificent. A pure caracal black with a chest like a war drum and legs that seemed to disdain the ordinary compromises of earth. What was also remembered was that somewhere between the Kyrgyz breeder and Zarif Khan's stable, something had happened to him. He did not permit touching. This was not mere skittishness. Rahim had known skittish horses, had learned their language, had understood that skittishness was fear wearing the costume of aggression, and that fear could be talked to, or rather, breathed too, stilled slowly with presence and patience. What the black stallion displayed was something different. It was not fear. Or rather, it was fear so old and so thoroughly transformed by experience that it had become something else. A standing policy. A first principle. A decision made at some point in the past and never revisited. The first handler, a man named Ghulam who had worked horses for 20 years, had lost 2 fingers and a portion of his left ear in the initial week. He had approached the horse with confidence, which was his error, because confidence in the presence of this horse read as threat. The horse had taken the fingers in a single quick motion, the ear in a second, and Ghulam had backed out of the stall bleeding and shrieking, and had not gone back. The second handler had lasted 4 days before the horse took him by the shoulder and shook him as a dog shakes a rat. He had survived, but the shoulder had healed wrong, and he now carried his left arm slightly high, like a man perpetually about to ask a question. The third man, a young cousin of Zarif Khan's who had volunteered with the overconfidence of someone who has not yet been truly hurt, had climbed over the reinforced stall door in a show of bravado and had been kicked in the sternum, so hard that he had flown backward into the opposite wall. He had died 3 days later in a room that smelled of camphor and desperate prayer. After this, Zarif Khan had declared the horse unrideable, which was not the same thing as giving up on him. He was too beautiful to give up on. He was also, by now, a matter of pride and reputation, and men like Zarif Khan could not afford to be defeated by horses. He had advertised, in the way such things were advertised, by word of mouth, by intermediaries, by the slow movement of information through the network of traders and travelers who passed through this part of Badakhshan. 3 men had come from other provinces, each claiming expertise, and 2 of them had left diminished, and 1 of them had left on a cart, unconscious, with a fractured jaw, and what the local man who served as doctor diagnosed as a broken something. The terminology was vague because the diagnostic tools were limited, but the man had not walked normally afterward. The horse stood in his reinforced stall and destroyed everything that came near him. And Rahim watched. This was what Rahim did. He watched, and waited, and thought about his father. His father's name had been Yusuf. Yusuf, son of Harun, of the Mongol clan, from the village of Sarpul, which was this same village under a different administration, when it had been governed by the 3 elder council that Zarif Khan had dissolved with fire and iron when Rahim was 9 years old. His father had been the village schoolteacher, which in this context meant a man who sat in the mosque after Friday prayers and taught the children to read from whatever materials were available. The Quran first, then, when they had the letters, whatever other texts could be obtained. He had also, because he was that kind of man, taught them other things. How to identify plants in the high mountain meadows, how the seasons moved, how to reason about a problem from its components rather than its surface. He had been, Rahim understood now with the clarity of adult retrospection, a dangerous man, dangerous in the specific way that men who teach clear thinking are dangerous to men whose power depends on muddled thinking. He had spoken at the council meeting, where Zarif Khan had first proposed his consolidation. Rahim didn't know exactly what he had said. He had been 9, and had waited outside, playing with a stone in the dust, while the men deliberated inside the mosque. But he knew from the way his mother had looked when his father came home that night that something irreversible had happened. His mother had the face of someone who has heard a sound she cannot unhear. His father had been arrested 6 days later on a charge of conspiring against the community's stability. The trial, such as it was, lasted 1 afternoon. The execution, hanging, from the mulberry tree in the village square, took place the following morning. Rahim had been told to stay inside. He had gone anyway, moving through the small back alleys of the village in the early light, standing at the edge of the gathered crowd where no one noticed a small boy. He had watched his father walk to the tree with his hands bound and his beard uncut from the days of his imprisonment, and he had heard his father say, in a voice that was not trembling, "I have not conspired against the community. I have only spoken in it." And then the men had done what they had come to do, and the mountains had watched, and the crows had waited in the high branches, and Rahim had stood in the snow with no shoes, because he had left in such haste that he had forgotten them, and the cold had moved up through his feet into his legs, and eventually he had become entirely cold, which he had remained, in some essential way, for 16 years. He had come to Sarpul a year ago, traveling from the provincial capital, where he had spent his adolescence and young adulthood in his mother's sister's household. His mother had died of what was probably pneumonia when he was 14, though the local term for it was simply chest sickness, and he had stayed with his aunt because there was nowhere else to go, and had worked in her husband's small goods shop, and had learned, in the specific school of a difficult adolescence in a household where he was tolerated rather than wanted, to be invisible. He had also learned horses, because his aunt's husband kept two, and because horses, unlike people, responded to presence rather than performance. You could not pretend anything to a horse. You could not charm a horse or intimidate a horse or construct a careful social identity for a horse's benefit. The horse responded only to what you actually were, to the quality of your attention, the steadiness of your breath, the authenticity of your stillness. Raheem had found this, as a lonely adolescent, to be the most honest relationship available to him. He had returned to Sarpool with a changed name. His mother had registered him in the city under her clan name, so he was Raheem Kale rather than Raheem, son of Yusuf, son of Harun, and with a careful story about origins, and with the single purpose that had organized his interior life for as long as he could remember. He had returned to be near Zarif Khan. He had returned to watch and wait. He had returned because the only complete thought in some deep chamber of his mind was not yet, not yet, not yet, which presupposed that the yet would eventually arrive. He had gotten the stable position because the previous stable boy had broken his leg falling from a ladder, and because Raheem had walked through the gate at the right moment and had demonstrated, in the immediate and pragmatic way that counts in such situations, that he knew what he was doing with horses. He had spent a year cleaning stalls and exercising the mares and carrying water and being, to everyone in the compound, nothing more than the stable boy, who was quiet and reliable and not worth thinking about. He had spent that year watching Zarif Khan and watching the black horse. Part 2. The Language of Wounds. The first night Raheem stayed after the rest of the compound had gone dark, he did not approach the stall. He did not even look directly at it. He sat on an overturned bucket 15 feet from the stall door, in the dense shadow near the mountain wall of the stable, and he simply existed there. The horse knew he was present. Of course it did. The horse's awareness of its immediate environment was total and continuous. Raheem could hear the quality of the animal's breathing change when he entered the stable, a slight quickening, a sharpening of attention, the sound of hooves shifting on the stone floor. But he did not approach, and so the horse, after a period of vigilance, subsided to a different register of attention, still tracking him, but no longer on immediate alert. He sat for 2 hours. Then he went to his sleeping mat and lay in the dark and listened to the wind against the stable walls. The second night he sat in the same place with a small piece of flatbread in his hand. He did not offer it. He ate it himself, slowly, and then sat for another hour with nothing. On the 5th night, he moved the bucket to 12 feet from the stall. He was patient in the way that only people who have waited a very long time for something are patient. Not the patience of someone who expects things to resolve quickly, but the patience of someone who has understood that certain things have their own temple logic and cannot be hurried without being destroyed. This was also, he recognized, how he had been approaching his revenge. Slowly, quietly, waiting for the moment to open. He thought about this, sitting in the dark while the horse breathed on the other side of the reinforced door. The parallel was not lost on him. He was trying to win the trust of something that had been damaged by violence, that had concluded from its experience that humans meant pain, that had built around itself a wall of aggression that was, if you looked at it correctly, a form of grief. He was not sure what this said about him, or about his plan, or about anything. He was not primarily a man who thought in symbols. He was primarily a man who thought in tactics. But the thought arrived anyway, unbidden and inconvenient, and he let it sit in him while the wind moved over the mountain and the horse shifted its weight from hoof to hoof in the dark. By the 3rd week, he had moved to 6 feet from the stall, and the horse was no longer shifting its hooves when he entered. By the 4th week, he was sitting with his back against the stall door, and the horse was standing close. He could hear the breathing on the other side of the wood, could feel the faint warmth radiating from the animal's mass through the boards. He began to speak. Not words, at first, sounds low and rhythmic, not quite singing and not quite speech, the sounds that existed in the space between. He talked about his father, Not in any conscious therapeutic way. Not because he thought the horse was listening, or cared, or could absorb the information, but because it was dark, and he was alone in the way that only people keeping dangerous secrets are alone, and the presence of the horse on the other side of the door was somehow like the presence of an entity that had no ability to betray him or to change its regard for him based on what he confessed. He talked about the morning of the execution. He talked about the quality of the light, which had been the thin blue-gray light that comes before proper dawn in high mountain valleys, the light that seems to come from the snow itself rather than from any sky. He talked about his father's voice, the steadiness of it, the way it had carried across the square without being raised. He talked about the mulberry tree, which was still there, which he could see from the compound gate, which had grown in the intervening years and whose branches were thicker now, heavier, as though the tree had fed on what had been done beneath it. The horse listened, or did something that resembled listening. Its breathing was regular and close. Once, near the end of that night session, Rahim heard the horse's nose touch the wooden door, a soft percussion, almost tentative, and then pull back. It was the first voluntary contact. Rahim recorded it in the ledger of small things that mattered, and said nothing, and went to bed. The 5th week, Rahim opened the stall door for the first time. He did not go in. He stood in the opening with one hand on the door frame and waited. The horse was at the far end of the stall, which was 7 feet away, which in a 7-foot stall meant the horse was as far from him as it could get. This was information. He stood in the opening for 40 minutes, until the horse's ears, which had been pinned flat against its skull, came slightly forward, not fully forward, not interested forward, but no longer in the position of absolute defensive alarm. Then he closed the door and went away. The next night he stood in the opening with a handful of dried apricots. He had brought them from the kitchen, slipping them into his pocket when the cook wasn't watching. He placed them on the ground just inside the door, stepped back, and waited. After 20 minutes, the horse had moved close enough to smell them, and Rahim had left. On the 3rd night of this, the horse took the apricots while Rahim was still in the doorway. This was the moment. He did not make any gesture of triumph. He did not lean forward or make a sound. He breathed slowly, the way he had been breathing for weeks, a specific quality of breath, deliberate and slow, the breath of someone who has nowhere to be and no particular feelings about where they are. He had developed his breath the way a musician develops an embouchure, consciously first, until it became automatic. The horse took the apricots from the ground and retreated to the back of the stall, watching him. He had been watching Rahim for weeks. Now, for the first time, Rahim watched back, not in the challenging way, not the hard direct eye contact that reads as aggression to a horse, but in the way you look at something you are trying to understand, sliding your gaze along the horse's body, reading what was written there. What was written there was extensive. The scarring along the horse's left flank was old enough to have healed into the coat's grain, visible only in certain lights, but visible. 3 parallel lines that could have been made by a whip with a knotted end, or possibly multiple strokes of a standard crop with enough force to break the skin. There were other marks, a notch in the right ear that was probably old frostbite or possibly a blade, a slight favoring of the right front leg that was not a lameness so much as a memory of one, the kind of residual caution that develops in an animal after an injury, and then persists after the injury has healed, because the nervous system doesn't easily unlearn pain. Someone, at some point in this horse's life, had decided that pain was the correct instructional medium. It had not produced the desired results. Rahim looked at the scars and thought about his father. He looked at the horse standing in the back of its stall, still watchful, still not fully trusting, but having chosen, having made an active choice, to take the apricots. Something in him that had been lock-shifted, slightly, in the dark. He didn't examine it. He went to bed. By the 6th week he was inside the stall. He had spent the first night inside simply standing near the door, back against the wall, not moving toward the horse. The horse had stood at the far end, and they had occupied the stall together for an hour in a kind of territorial negotiation, not aggressive, but careful, each of them taking stock. By the 3rd night inside, Rahim was sitting on the floor with his back to the far corner, which put the horse above him, which was intentional. Animals, all animals, but horses particularly, are attentive to height and its implications. Rahim was making himself small, and the horse, he thought, was noticing. The first touch happened on the 9th night inside the stall. Rahim was sitting in his corner, and the horse was standing, not far from him now, and was lowering its head by degrees, the way horses do when they are moving toward trust. The head coming down, the neck softening, the quality of the animal's attention shifting from vigilance to something that might eventually become interest. And then the horse's nose touched Rahim's knee. Just briefly. A second, perhaps less. Then the head came back up, and the horse stepped back, and they looked at each other in the dark. Rahim sat very still. He was aware of his own heartbeat, which was faster than he would have liked. "All right," he said, very quietly. Just those 2 words in Dari, which is a language that has always been better than most for the transaction of quiet truths. Part 3. The Memory of Fire. Winter deepened. The mountains above the valley were now fully white, and the cold that came down from them at night was the kind of cold that had intent. The water in the troughs froze by midnight and had to be broken each morning with the handle of a rake. Rahim's hands were permanently chapped from this work, the skin at his knuckles cracked and bleeding in the way that hands crack and bleed when they are wet and cold repeatedly for months. He moved through his daytime duties with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose attention is located somewhere else. He was present enough to do the work correctly. Zarif Khan was the kind of man who noticed errors, and the noticing had consequences. But the part of his mind that was truly alive was in another register entirely. He watched Zarif Khan. He had been watching him for a year, cataloging everything with the patience of someone who believes that knowledge is a form of power even before it becomes a form of action. He knew Zarif Khan's habits, the schedule of his days, the geography of his moods. He knew that the tribal leader was most volatile in the late morning, after the second session of meetings with the men who brought disputes for his resolution. Those sessions wore on him, because he was not a subtle man, and disputes required subtlety, and the chafing showed. He knew that Zarif Khan drank less than his reputation suggested and ate more, and that his genuine enthusiasms were limited to 3 things. Horses, the particular kind of storytelling that doubled as self-mythologization, and the annual spring gathering. The spring gathering. It happened every year after the snows began to melt, usually in late March or early April, when the lower meadows showed their first thin color. The entire valley came, every family, from every settlement that acknowledged Zarif Khan's authority, which was every settlement within a day's ride. They came with their goods and their animals and their disputes, and there were 3 days of market and deliberation and, most centrally, of display. Zarif Khan used the gathering to remind everyone of what he was and what he controlled. There was food distributed from his stores, which was generosity as theater. There were judgments rendered publicly, which was power as theater. And there was, always, a horse demonstration. Zarif Khan riding his finest horse through a series of maneuvers, sometimes racing against the young men of the valley, always winning by arrangement if not by speed. For the past 2 years, the gathering had been shadowed by the problem of the black stallion. Zarif Khan had acquired the horse in anticipation of riding it at a gathering, had announced this intention, and had then been unable to fulfill it. This had cost him something he could not afford to lose, and could not openly acknowledge losing face. The horse standing in its reinforced stall was a daily embarrassment, a visible failure, a thing that refused to be controlled by the most powerful man in the valley. Rahim had understood this almost immediately. He had also understood, as the weeks of night sessions in the stall accumulated, as the horse's head came down further and stayed down longer, as the touch became mutual, the horse permitting Rahim's hand on its neck, on its face, eventually on the long line of its spine, that something was becoming possible. The gathering was 2 months away. He had 2 months. He thought it was enough. He began the work of what he could only call, in the privacy of his own mind, the plan. The plan, such as it was, had never been specific. He had come to Sarpool with a generalized intention, to return, to witness, to find the moment, but without a concrete form for what that moment would look like. He had imagined, in the years before returning, various scenarios, all of them violent, none of them realistic. He had imagined poisoning and knives and fire. He had been, in those imaginings, the kind of man who could do such things without hesitation, as though the wound in him was large enough to grant him capacities he did not actually possess. Now here, with the horse's trust in his hands like something that could still be dropped, he had a different kind of plan. Clearer, more theatrical, more satisfying in a way that fitting symmetry is satisfying. He would train the horse. He would bring him to a state where he could be ridden by Rahim, specifically, because the horse trusted Rahim, and Rahim understood now that this trust was non-transferable. He would ride the horse at the gathering, in front of the entire valley, and demonstrate that the horse could be mastered. He would then, in the subsequent commotion and general amazement, find a moment to do what needed to be done. This was the plan at its core, though its final chapter remained blurry. He told himself the blurriness was tactical, that the specific moment would present itself, and he would recognize it. He did not fully examine the possibility that the blurriness was something else. He put a halter on the horse for the first time on a night when the wind was particularly loud against the mountain wall, which masked any sounds from the stall. He had brought the halter, a soft one, braided leather with no metal fittings, and had spent 3 sessions letting the horse smell and investigate it before he attempted to use it. He slipped it over the horse's nose while the animal was eating from his hand, moving slowly, stopping if there was any sign of tension, resuming when the tension passed. The horse accepted it. This was not the same thing as liking it. The horse's ears went briefly flat, and then came forward, and the body held a quality of managed alarm, but it did not pull away, and it did not strike. Rahim held the lead rope loosely, barely any pressure, letting the horse feel the sensation of it without any consequence attached. He stood there for 20 minutes, holding the rope with no intention, just presence. Then he removed the halter and gave the horse the rest of the dried apricots and went to bed. He had started thinking of the horse as Ruh, soul. He had not intended to name him. Naming was relationship, and relationship was complication, and he had been trying to manage his emotional involvement with the care of a man handling something flammable. But the name had arrived one night without his permission, the way things arrive when you've been spending a lot of time with something in the dark, and he had not been able to unreceive it. Ruh. It fit, in the way that all the right names fit, not because it described the animal accurately, but because it described what the animal was in relation to Rahim. The horse had become, over these weeks, something like the part of him that was still alive in ways his public life could not afford. He found this thought alarming. He filed it away. He dreamed of his father frequently now, more than he had in years. The dreams were not dramatic. They were not the nightmare of the execution, which he had dreamed in his childhood until it became so familiar it lost its horror and became simply a recurring piece of furniture in the rooms of his sleep. These were different dreams, ordinary scenes, domestic, mundane. His father sitting in the house at night with a borrowed book, squinting in the inadequate light of the oil lamp. His father's hands, which had been a schoolteacher's hands, not the hands of physical labor, but not soft either, calloused in the specific way of a man who had always lived at the edge of difficulty. His father teaching him to recognize the plants in the high meadows, lifting a small flower and saying, "Look, this one. Do you see the difference in the petal?" The pedagogical reflex, so deep it operated even in recreation. He woke from these dreams with a feeling that was not grief exactly, but the place that grief had scraped clean, the hollow that remains after you've been carrying something heavy for long enough that even after you set it down, the shape of the carrying stays with you. He lay in the dark of the stable loft and listened to the horses below and thought about what he was doing and why. Why was the question he had never permitted himself to sit with directly, because the answer seemed self-evident. His father had been murdered. The man who had ordered it was still here, still doing it, not to his father, who was beyond further harm, but to others. The year he had spent in the compound had shown him this. 3 men beaten for insufficient deference. A family evicted from their home, for a debt Zarif Khan had decided, unilaterally, was unpaid. A young man from the eastern end of the valley, who had come to dispute the seizure of his family's small flock, who had been found 3 days later at the base of the cliff road, which could have been an accident, and which no one believed was an accident. So the why seemed clear: justice, which in the absence of any apparatus for justice meant its older, rawer form. But lying in the dark with his father's face still warm in his mind from the dream, he found himself thinking about something his father had actually said. Not in the dream, in life, in one of those specific moments that lodge in memory for reasons that only become clear later. He had been perhaps 7, and there had been some conflict with another boy in the village, some ordinary childhood cruelty, and Rahim had come home furious and wanting his father to confirm the furious version of events, and his father had sat with him and listened and then had said, "The man who injures you already has a punishment. He lives inside himself." He had not, at 7, understood what this meant. He was not sure he understood it now, but it was his father's voice saying it, and his father's voice saying anything was a kind of presence in the absence, and he lay in the dark and turned the words over. Part 4. The Weight That Fits the Hand. 1 month before the gathering, Rahim rode the horse for the first time. He had been leading him outside the stall for 2 weeks by then, through the stable, out into the pre-dawn darkness of the compound's back corner, where there was a small enclosure used for storing hay bales that he had cleared and was using as a private space. The horse moved differently outside the stall, more alert, more alive to the world, but not in the panic-alert way, the way of an animal looking for threats, more in the way of an animal remembering what it was to have space. The first saddle had been a blanket, not a saddle. He'd had no way to produce a saddle without attracting questions, and the blanket was available in the stable without comment. He had spent 3 nights with the blanket, placing it on the horse's back and removing it, over and over, until the gesture became unremarkable. The horse had flinched initially at the weight of it. Another piece of information about what had been done to him, about the context in which saddles and weight had previously appeared. On the night he first rode, Rahim stood on a hay bale and put his weight gradually on the horse's back with his hands before swinging his leg over. He spoke continuously, low and rhythmic, the sound more important than the words, the steadiness of the sound the thing that mattered. And the horse, Roo, stood still, moved once, a shifting of weight, and then stood still. Rahim sat on the horse's back in the pre-dawn darkness of the Afghan mountains, and did not move, and did not speak, and breathed slowly, and felt the horse's breathing beneath him synchronize, gradually, to his own. They stood like that for 10 minutes. Then he slid off, removed the blanket, gave the horse the apricots, and went inside. He sat on his sleeping mat, and pressed his hands flat on the floor, and felt that they were shaking. He sat with the shaking for a while. He had not expected the shaking. He had expected efficiency, the achievement of a tactical objective, a data point in his slow accumulation of capability toward his purpose. He had not expected to feel, when he sat on the horse's back in the cold dark and felt the animal's massive warm presence accepting him, like crying. He did not cry, but the pressure of it was real, and he acknowledged the pressure, and then he breathed and waited for it to subside, and thought about the gathering. By 3 weeks out, he was riding at a walk and occasionally a trot through the small enclosure. The horse was not fully what he had been. The training that had been done to him, by whoever had done it, had left damage that patience was beginning to address, but had not fully resolved. There was still a flinch response to certain sudden sounds. There was still the occasional flat ear when asked to do something new, though the flat ear now preceded compliance rather than attack, which was a fundamental shift. The horse was choosing, repeatedly, to trust Rahim, and Rahim was taking this seriously in the way that all genuine trust, once given, demands to be taken seriously. He thought about Zarif Khan and the demonstration. The plan, refined over weeks of night thinking, was this. At the gathering, he would offer to ride the black horse. He would frame it a service, as something he had been working on quietly for the compound's benefit. The offer would be surprising, and Zarif Khan would likely be suspicious, but Zarif Khan's pride would override the suspicion, because the offer would be made publicly, in front of everyone, and declining it would look like fear, while accepting it would look like the horse had finally been tamed under his authority. Zarif Khan would accept, and then Rahim would ride the horse through the gathering ground. And then, was still the blurry part. He had a knife, which everyone had a knife. It was a tool, not a weapon. There was nothing remarkable about it. He had imagined, in various late-night sessions, the moment of proximity it would create. He had imagined Zarif Khan nearby, the horse between them, the crowd watching something else, the moment opening. He had also, increasingly, been imagining his father's hands, the school teacher's hands, slightly calloused, the hands that had lifted small mountain flowers. He pushed the image aside and focused on the writing. 2 weeks before the gathering, something happened that changed the shape of the plan. Rahim was in the stable in the afternoon, cleaning the Mara's stalls, when Zarif Khan came in to inspect, which he did occasionally, walking slowly down the row of stalls with his hands behind his back, assessing. He rarely spoke during these inspections. His presence itself was the point, a reminder that the horses were his, and that all work done in their service was done under his observation. He stopped in front of Ru's stall. The horse was standing quietly. Midday was his calm period, the high alert hours being dawn and dusk, and he turned his head to look at Zarif Khan with what Rahim, watching from the far end of the stable, read as recognition. Not the recognition of a horse seeing its owner. A different recognition. Zarif Khan made a sound, a click of the tongue, the sound people make to attract a horse's attention, and held out his hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of offering. The horse's response was immediate and total. It was as though a current had passed through the animal. The head came up, the ears went flat. The weight shifted back onto the haunches in the preparatory position that Rahim had learned to read as the precursor to striking. The horse's nostrils flared, and the sound it made was not a whinny or a snort, but something lower and more guttural. A sound from the chest, a sound that had memory in it. Zarif Khan stepped back. He did not flee. He was not the kind of man who fled from horses, but he stepped back with a promptness that was itself a form of flight, and his hand came down, and for a moment his face showed something that he immediately covered with the expression of controlled displeasure that was his public face. But Rahim had seen it in the single second before the covering. He had seen fear, and beneath the fear, something that was not quite guilt, but was guilt's geological residue, the compressed layer left by something done and not examined. And Rahim understood, in the sudden and complete way that understanding sometimes arrives, why the horse was what it was. He looked at the scarring on the horse's flank, the 3 parallel lines, old and healed, in the coat's grain. He looked at Zarif Khan's hands, the wide hands of a man who had never done agricultural work, but had done other kinds of work, the hands he had seen use a whip in the course of last autumn's confrontation with the man from the Eastern Valley. He looked at the horse and the man looking at each other across the reinforced stall door, and he understood the complete history of the horse, which was also the complete history of his own. The horse had been Zarif Khan's, or rather had passed through Zarif Khan's direct ownership, before whatever trading arrangement had produced the fiction of the Uzbek horseman and the Kyrgyz breeder. Or perhaps those were real and Zarif Khan had acquired him after. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the horse recognized him. The horse recognized him the way the body recognizes what has hurt it, not with the mind but with the older systems, the systems that are below thought, in the nerves and the muscles and the standing hair. Zarif Khan left the stable without speaking. The horse stood in its stall for a long time afterward with the flat ears and the guttural chest sound, the sound of old injury re-inhabited. Rahim stood in the stable and held very still. He was reconsidering everything. Part 6. The Gathering. The snow had been retreating for 3 weeks by the time the gathering began, pulling back up the mountainsides with the slowness of a great concession, revealing the brown earth below and then, tentatively, the first suggestions of green. The lower meadow that served as the gathering ground was clear, muddy at its edges, the grass coming back in patches. By the second morning of the 3-day event, there were perhaps 400 people. Families camped in clusters, fires going through the night, the smoke of them rising straight in the cold, still air before being taken by whatever wind moved at altitude. There were traders with their goods spread on flat stones, men with disputes they had traveled to have adjudicated, young men performing the specific theater of youth, competitive and loud, and wearing their best things. Zarif Khan had set up his formal reception space in a large tent of dark red canvas at the center of the meadow. He received throughout the morning, seated on cushions with 4 armed men behind him, his white beard combed and his best turban arranged with the care of a man who understands that ceremony is a form of power. People came before him with gifts and problems. He dispensed from his apparent abundance, which was their actual abundance, and made judgments that were occasionally wise and consistently self-interested. Rahim had been at the gathering since the first day, serving in the general capacity of horse handler, Several of the compound's horses had been brought, as was customary, for display and potential trading. He moved through the crowd in his capacity as nothing, carrying water and hay, invisible, watchful. He had been waiting for a specific moment for 2 days. Rue was in a temporary enclosure at the edge of the gathering ground. He had transported the horse here with help from one of the other stable boys, maintaining the fiction that the horse was simply being brought as Zarif Khan's property. No different from the others. Rue had been tense in transit, the sounds and smells of so many people, so many animals, but had managed it, holding himself at the edge of panic and choosing, repeatedly, not to cross it. Rahim had been close to him throughout, talking in low continuous murmur, the sound more than the words. The horse demonstration was scheduled for midday on the 3rd day, which was today. Zarif Khan would ride his gray, the old reliable gelding, not ideal for performance, but predictable, through a series of traditional maneuvers while someone played the drum. It was the centerpiece of the gathering's theater, the visible statement of authority and prosperity. Rahim had spent the preceding night in the temporary enclosure with Rue, sleeping on the ground beside the horse, one hand on the animal's leg, both of them breathing in the cold meadow air while the gathering settled into its nighttime sounds around them. He had woken before dawn and lain still, looking up at the stars through the slats of the enclosure, thinking. He had thought about the plan, and about his father, and about the moment in the stable when the horse had recognized Zarif Khan with its whole body. The way the body knows what the mind has tried to rationalize away. He had thought about what his father had said. The man who injures you already has a punishment. He lives inside himself. He had not yet decided what he was going to do. He understood, lying in the cold dark with the horse's warmth against his side, that this was the truth he had been avoiding. The plan had always had a blurry final chapter, and the blurriness was not tactical. It was the part of him that was still his father's son. At midday, Rahim walked to the red canvas tent. Zarif Khan was holding his midday reception. There were perhaps 30 men in and around the tent. The crowd of the gathering thickened at its center. Rahim walked to the edge of the carpet that defined the formal reception space and stood until one of the men noticed him and came over, frowning, to ask what he wanted. "I have something to show the Khan," Rahim said. His voice was steady. He had been practicing steady for 16 years. "About the black horse." The man went inside. There was a wait. Then Rahim was gestured in. He stood before Zarif Khan in the red tent with the smell of the gathering around him, wood smoke, cooked meat, animal, cold earth, and looked at the man who had hanged his father. He looked at him carefully, the way he had been looking at him for a year, the careful cataloging look, and Zarif Khan looked back with the pale gray eyes and the assessment in them and the complete absence, as always, of any register of guilt or doubt. "You work in the stable," Zarif Khan said. Not a question. He remembered his people the way an inventory keeper remembers stock. "What about the black horse?" "I can ride him," Rahim said. The tent went quiet in the particular way that interesting information makes a space quiet. Zarif Khan's eyes did not change their expression, but something behind them sharpened. "No one can ride him," Zarif Khan said. "I can. I've been working with him for months." There was a silence. Rahim could feel the calculation behind those pale eyes, the suspicion, the pride, the arithmetic of what this could mean if it was true, and what it would cost if it wasn't. "If you can ride the black horse," Zarif Khan said slowly, "you may ride him at this afternoon's demonstration." "In front of everyone," Rahim said. "Yes." Another silence. "And if you cannot?" Rahim met those pale eyes directly, for the first and only time in a year of careful downward-cast glances. "Then I accept whatever consequence you see fit." He saw something move in Zarif Khan's face, the smallest recognition, perhaps, that this young man was not quite what he had seemed. Then it was covered, as everything was covered, by the composed public face. "This afternoon," Zarif Khan said. "We'll see." Part 7. The Moment the Mountain Watches. The crowd gathered for the demonstration around the roped-off area that had been prepared in the center of the meadow. It was the largest audience the gathering had assembled. Word had spread, the way word always spreads through gatherings, by whisper and gesture and the movement of bodies toward wherever something interesting is happening. 400 people, perhaps more, standing in the thin mountain sunlight, with their breath coming in small clouds. Zarif Khan rode first, as was customary, on the gray gelding. The demonstration was competent. The old horse moved through its paces obediently, and the tribal leader sat him with the authority of a man who has spent his life mounted and knows how to look impressive while mounted. The drum played. The crowd made the appropriate sounds. Then a ripple went through the crowd as Rahim led Ru into the demonstration area. The horse was extraordinary to look at. Rahim had known this in the intimacy of their nights together, but here, in the open light, against the white backdrop of the mountains and the dark backdrop of the 400 watching faces, the animal's beauty had a quality of declaration about it. The black coat in the mountain light, the massive chest, the way the horse moved even at a walk, with a contained power that looked like controlled intention. The crowd knew this horse. Everyone at the gathering knew the story of the black horse that had killed a man and maimed others, that had stood in its reinforced stall as an emblem of the one thing Zarif Khan had not been able to subdue. They watched in a silence that was not the silence of indifference, but the silence of held breath. Rahim walked the horse to the center of the demonstration area. He was wearing the same clothes he always wore. There was no costume available to him, no ceremonial preparation, only what he had. He was aware of himself as he was 25, unremarkable, dressed for stable work in an open mountain meadow in front of everyone who lived in this world. He looked across the rope barrier at the crowd, and in the crowd, at the near edge, Zarif Khan on the gray gelding, watching. The horse had been still throughout the walk into the demonstration area, alert as always in crowds, but managing the alertness, the ears moving, reading the sounds, but not pinned, not in the defensive position. Rahim had one hand on the lead, barely any pressure, the rope a formality rather than a control. He had Ru's trust, and the trust was the control, and both of them knew it. Then the wind shifted. It was a slight thing, a change in the air's direction, the kind of shift that happens constantly in mountain valleys, where the topography shapes the air into complex local patterns. The shift brought a new mixture of scents across the demonstration area, and among those scents was whatever specific combination of human sweat and animal smell and something else, some scent marker, something old and particular, that belonged to Zarif Khan. The horse knew it in the same instant the scent arrived. The response was physical and total and happened faster than Rahim could speak. The horse's head came up with a violence that felt like the swing of a gate in a hard wind, the neck extending, the nostrils wide, the sound that came from the chest, that low, guttural sound, the sound of memory, filling the demonstration area and the silence around it. The horse turned, and the turn was not random, was not the blind panic of a frightened animal, but was directed, oriented, aimed, the way a compass needle is aimed, towards Zarif Khan at the edge of the rope barrier, on the gray gelding that had begun to dance sideways in sympathetic alarm. The crowd scattered back from the rope barrier. People were shouting. The gray gelding was now in serious flight response, and Zarif Khan, who was a competent rider but who had been caught off guard, was working to hold it. Ru moved toward the barrier, not at a run, at something worse than a run, at the deliberate, focused walk of an animal that has decided something, moving with its full weight concentrated into intention. The flat ears, the neck low, the enormous, dark body moving through the scattered people who got out of its way without needing to be told. Rahim moved. He had not dropped the lead rope. He had his hand on it, and he moved with the horse, not trying to stop it. That was not possible. Not in this moment. Not with this much intention in the animal, but staying with it, his hand on the rope, his voice going, the low continuous murmur he had been building for months. I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. Not those words exactly. The sounds beneath words. They covered 20 feet. Zarif Khan's gray was now fully panicking, rearing, and Zarif Khan was still mounted, but only barely. The composure of the formal reception gone, replaced by the visceral reality of a man on a horse that is trying to leave at the same time a more frightening horse is approaching. His pale eyes were wide. Rahim felt the moment. It opened the way his father had said moments open, not with a sound or a signal, but with a quality of availability. The way a door that has been stuck suddenly presents itself as unstuck, and you know it before you've tried it. The rope in his hand, the horse aimed at the man who had made it. The crowd pushed back on all sides. A clear radius of space around the two horses and the two men. The knife at his belt. He was close enough. He was, for the first time in 16 years of not yet close enough. He looked at Zarif Khan's face. The pale eyes, wide now, showing the white. The composed authority dissolved, the public face gone, and underneath it, not the monster, not the singular darkness he had been carrying in his mind for 16 years like a coal, but a man, old, frightened, the fear on his face the same fear that was on everyone's face when something they had done came back to them in the form of a consequence. And Rahim's father's voice, the man who injures you already has a punishment. He lives inside himself. He pulled the rope. He put everything he had into it. Not the force of his arms, because force wasn't how you worked with Rue. Not anymore. But the force of their accumulated trust. The weight of all those nights in the dark stable. The weeks of patience. The apricots and the low sounds, and the first touch of the horse's nose against his knee, and the night he had sat on the horse's back in the dark and felt, unexpectedly, like crying. All of it in the rope, in the hand, in the voice that came out of him now louder than he'd intended, cutting through the shouting crowd. Rue. Just the name he had not intended to give, that had arrived without his permission. The horse stopped. Not immediately. The momentum of the intention carried it another step, and another, before the name reached through to wherever the horse lived when it was in this state. But it stopped, stood still, flanks heaving, the guttural sound still in its chest, but quieter now, the ears in the uncertain middle position between flat and forward. Rahim moved to the horse's head. He put both hands on the horse's face, one on each side, his palms flat against the jaw in the way that the horse had allowed for the first time 6 weeks ago. The way that meant, I am here. You are here. This is the present moment. I am asking you to be in it with me. He breathed. Slow, deliberate, the breath he had practiced. He felt the horse breathe with him. The sound from the chest diminished. The ears came forward, uncertain, reading Rahim's face with the focused attention of an animal determining whether the thing in front of it is safe. The great body, still tense, began to allow the tension's edge to soften. The crowd was very quiet. Part 8, What the Mountains Keep. In the quiet, Rahim became aware of everything at once. The thin mountain sunlight, which had moved in its arc while all of this had happened, and was now on the western faces of the peaks. The smell of the gathered people, hundreds of them, collective and particular. The sound of the gray gelding, calmed now too, and breathing hard somewhere behind him. The horse's face in his hands, the dark eyes watching him, his own hands, chapped and bleeding at the knuckles, holding the horse's face. He turned. Zarif Khan had dismounted. He was standing 6 feet away, the gray's lead in one hand, and his other hand, the wide hand, the hand with the whip, was at his side. The composed face had reassembled itself to a degree, but incompletely, the way a building is reassembled after a portion of it has come down, and the remaining structure can only approximate what it was before. He was looking at Rahim with an expression that was new, that Rahim, in a year of watching, had not seen. It was the expression of someone seeing someone clearly for the first time, and finding the seeing uncomfortable. You trained him, Zarif Khan said. It was not precisely a question. Yes, Rahim said. No one else could. No. A silence. The crowd around them was a solid thing. Silent. Hundreds of people watching this exchange without being able to hear it, reading its meaning from posture and proximity. Who are you? Zarif Khan said. And this was the question that had existed in potential since Rahim had walked through the compound gate a year ago, since he had constructed his careful story of no father and provincial origin, since he had learned to keep his eyes down and his voice in the register of someone with no interior life worth examining. He looked at Zarif Khan. He felt the horse's warmth beside him, the lead rope in his hand, the cold mountain air on his face. He thought about his father walking to the mulberry tree with his hands bound and his voice steady. He thought about the words that had lodged in him and would not leave. I have not conspired against the community. I have only spoken in it. My father's name was Yusuf, Rahim said, son of Harun, from this village. He watched Zarif Khan's face. He watched the name arrive in the pale gray eyes, watched it find the thing it was looking for there, The memory, the specific transaction, the morning 16 years ago that the mountains had witnessed and would never testify to. He watched the face process this information and attempt to manage it and find the managing more difficult than usual. He was a schoolteacher, Rahim said. He spoke at the council meeting. You hanged him from the mulberry tree that is still standing at the edge of the square, and I watched from behind the crowd because I had been told to stay inside, and I went anyway, without my shoes, and I stood in the snow. He paused. His voice had remained, to his surprise, the voice he intended, not trembling, not theatrical, not the voice of revenge or of grief, but something cleaner. His father's voice, perhaps, the voice of someone saying a thing that is true, without decoration. I came here to kill you, he said. The crowd could not hear these words. They saw a young stable boy speaking quietly to a tribal leader, which was unusual, but not dramatic. They saw the black horse standing calmly. They could not see the conversation. Zarif Khan was still. The horse would have helped me, Rahim said. He remembered you. Whatever you did to him, wherever you did it, he remembered. He looked at the horse's face, and then back at Zarif Khan. He recognized what hurt him. He stopped. He felt the moment, not the moment of action, which had passed, but the moment of finality, the closing of something that had been open for 16 years. But I'm not going to, he said. Not because you don't deserve it, not because what you did to my father was anything other than murder, but because my father was not a violent man, and I am his son, and I have had enough of carrying this long enough to know that it has not stopped being heavy, and I am setting it down. He looked at Zarif Khan's face. He looked carefully, the way he had been looking at things his whole life, cataloging. He saw what he saw. An old man who had spent 61 years building walls of power and fear around a center that had never been examined, and who was now, in this mountain meadow, being asked to stand in the examination with no walls available. What you did will come for you, Rahim said. Not from me. From the weight of it. It already is. He turned back to the horse. He put his forehead briefly against the horse's face, a thing he had never done in front of anyone, a thing that was private, and which he did now, because the private had become public in ways that could not be walked back, and so he allowed himself this last piece of truth. The horse stood still and permitted it. Then he led Rue back through the crowd. Epilogue: what the snow keeps. He left the valley the next morning. He had known he would. The staying had always been contingent on the moment, and the moment had come and gone, and what remained was his life, which needed to be lived somewhere. He did not know where exactly. The provincial capital. Further, perhaps. There were cities he had never seen, places that did not carry his father in every stone. He packed a few things he had. A blanket, a change of clothes, the small book of Persian poetry that had belonged to his mother and that he had carried without reading for years, and had recently, in the nights of waiting and thinking, started to read. He did not take the knife. He left it on the sleeping mat with no particular ceremony, the way you leave something you no longer need. He went to the stable before dawn. Rue was awake, watching the doorway as Rahim entered. He crossed to the stall and stood with his forearms on the door and looked at the horse for a long time. The horse looked back with the dark eyes that had learned, over months of deliberate patience, to receive a gaze without reading it as threat. He gave the horse the last of the dried apricots, which he had been hoarding. "You're going to be all right," he said. He was aware this was the kind of thing that is said for the speaker's benefit rather than the listener's, and he said it anyway. Whoever they put with you, make them earn it. Make them be patient. He did not say what he was thinking, which was, "You will remember me, for a while, and then you will not, and that is all right. That is how it should be." He did not say it because it was for his own benefit, and he had already had enough of that this morning. He put his forehead against the horse's face one more time. Then he picked up his bag and walked through the compound gate and onto the mountain road as the first light began to separate itself from the darkness in the east, the way light in mountain valleys always begins, not with warmth, but with distinction, the things of the world becoming visible before they become clear. He walked down the road with the mountains on both sides of him, white and absolute, witnesses to everything and testifiers to nothing. The cold was the first cold of the morning, the coldest cold, the cold that would begin to ease as the sun climbed. His breath came in clouds. His boots made the sound of boots on packed snow, specific and real. He did not look back at the mulberry tree. He had looked at it enough. He thought about his father, which was not something he had allowed himself to do openly, without the filter of the plan and the purpose and the anger. He thought about what it would mean to grieve his father completely, to lay the anger down with the knife, and simply mourn, to become someone who had lost his father rather than someone who had been assigned a mission by the loss. He had been carrying the mission for so long, he was not entirely certain what remained underneath it, whether there was a Rahim beneath the plan, whether the person who had wept on a summer night at his mother's bedside and said, "I will make this right," had been making a promise to his mother or a prison for himself. He suspected both. He suspected that most promises are both. In the valley behind him, in the compound that sat at the highest point of the village that sat cupped between mountains, a tribal leader sat in his formal reception tent in the thin morning light and was very quiet. The men around him interpreted this quiet as the contemplative silence of authority and did not disturb it. They did not know, and he would never tell them, that the silence was the silence of a man sitting alone with something he had never sat alone with before, the specific, weighty, uncompartmentalizable fact of what he had done and what he had been seen to have done by a boy he had not known was watching, who had grown into a man who had returned not to hide from what he had seen, but to carry it back and set it down at his feet. The horse stood in the reinforced stall. It would not let anyone approach it except the stable boy, who had been standing at the far end of the stable the previous afternoon and had watched the whole thing with his eyes very wide. This boy, who was 15 and not yet committed to any particular interpretation of the world, would spend the next months learning, with great patience and many small failures, how to be trusted by an animal that had not intended to trust again. He would do this without fully understanding why he was doing it, which meant he would do it purely, without the contamination of theory. The horse would, eventually, let him in. Rahim reached the road switchback that curved away from the valley before the sun had fully risen. He stopped and looked out at the world below, not at the village, which was behind him, but at the valley as a whole, the long white and brown shape of it, the river that was just now beginning to run with snow melt, the scattered dark squares of settlements, the high meadows that would be green in a month. He breathed cold air, mountain air, the specific smell of snow in morning. He thought of his father standing at the mulberry tree, saying, "I have not conspired against the community. I have only spoken in it." He thought of this and understood, perhaps for the first time, without the scrim of grief and anger distorting the view, that his father had not been trying to perform courage in that moment. He had simply been telling the truth. That was who he was. A man who told the truth when the truth cost something, not out of bravery exactly, but out of an inability to be other than what he was. A schoolteacher to the end, saying, "Look, do you see the difference in a petal?" Rahim thought, "I see it." He turned and walked down the road, into the widening light, his breath going before him in small ghosts that dissolved in the cold air, and the mountain stood behind him, and the snow was very white, and the world was continuing, as the world does, with the complete indifference of something that will outlast everything done within it, the cruelty and the patience, the anger and the mercy, the long revenge and the longer forgiveness, and in that indifference there was something that was not comfort exactly, but was the thing that lives in the same country as comfort, the thing you find when you set down what you've been carrying and find you can still walk. He walked. The road went down. The light came up. In the mountains of Badakhshan, there's a saying, "The snow keeps what the earth forgets." This is not true. The snow keeps nothing. It melts in the spring like everything melts, and what it covered is simply the earth again, unchanged, neither punished nor rewarded, waiting for what comes next to come. What comes next always comes.